Welcome to this morning's meeting of the Culture, Media and Sports Select Committee, and today we are holding one of our State of Play sessions on performing arts touring in the EU, where we're going to examine the barriers of performance artists and musicians, what they're facing when they're working or touring in the world post-Brexit, particularly the EU. Our first panel is looking at the performing arts and acting sector, and we're joined by Matt Hood, who is the Managing Director of Spotlight, Euan Livingstone, who is the agent for Global Artists, and Tom Peters, who's Head of Policy and Public Affairs at Equity. Thank you so much for joining us all today. It's great to see you. And before we begin, I just need to remind members to declare any interest at the point that they ask their questions. Matt, I'm going to kick off these questions, and I want to start with you. Why are we here today? Why is touring the EU important?
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, members of the committee, for taking up Spotlight's request to hear this conversation on Brexit and the impact on our performer members as well. Both actors and musicians have a long history of travelling widely for work. Well before the time of Shakespeare, the first professional actors, the strolling players, would take their work on the road, usually around the UK or the British Islands as they were, but occasionally where global politics allowed, into Europe. And ever since, the peripatetic nature of both workers and work in the performing arts, in our entertainment and culture industries, has been a fundamental part of the lifeblood of our sector. And it's not just about the freedom of movement of creative labour and the opportunities that it brings and how that sustains rewarding and professional careers. It's also about how that movement sustains and endures cultural exchange as well, how we share perspectives and information, and how we open eyes and hearts to appreciate both similarity and difference. And so it's the narrowing of both the opportunity and of the cultural exchange that has put Brexit at the top of the list of concerns that performers who subscribe to Spotlight have, as well as those other users, agents and casting professionals. And in producing the report for the committee that you've read, I hope, we call for evidence from actors who subscribe to our service and to members of casting guilds, associations and societies, of agents associations and bodies representing UK drama schools. And those who responded did so anonymously and to provide a safe space to share their feelings without fear of reprisal. And the report that I hope you've seen makes depressing reading. Brexit has placed British performers in a cultural cul-de-sac. And in place of the rich opportunities that we saw before, from cruise ships to summer seasons, from touring theatre and commercials, British performers are faced with paperwork, costly, time-consuming, often impenetrable. An actor's suitability for a job is no longer a question of their talent or their availability, but about which passport they hold and whether the productions have the time, the budget, or the inclination to tackle those various visa processes. These burdens are shared along the line with talent agents, with casting professionals and others. And so that is why we asked you to look at this issue today, because those impacts of Brexit on our industry and on the performers, actors, and those who augment those as well is quite profound. So hopefully this session today will enlighten you as to those concerns that we brought to you.
Thanks, Matt. What I want to do is just have a quick fire answer from all of you, if possible, about the changes that you've just seen to the volume of work that's available to UK performers since Brexit. Tom.
Yes, about half our members say that they've lost work as a result of the changes regarding Brexit. So we're a membership organisation of 50,000 members, so about 25,000.
Okay, thank you. Euan?
At the point of submission, which is part of my job, we're the ones that put actors in for certain jobs. Often we're met with a barrier straight away where they're saying, please don't even bother submitting people unless they hold a European passport, due to the nature of how quick the turnover is for getting these projects cast. And then on top of that, some actors have had to leave jobs because it's just not affordable, and then visa requirements, etc. They just don't have the time to do it. So many actors are just having to say no from the first step.
Matt, what sort of volume of change are you seeing?
I mean, the volume of work in Europe, I don't think has changed dramatically since Brexit. It's the access to that work by UK performers that is dropping.
Well, that's the question.
Yes.
What changes have you seen to the volume of work available to UK performers since Brexit?
I think the big factor is that a lot of the times those jobs are looking for people who already have European passports, and they are filtering out British performers or making sure they're calling only for performers who hold a European passport already. And it's that lack of opportunity where you are being weeded out before even being able to see the job that is most profound.
Makes sense. Okay, and then just from all of you as well, does this actually have any bearing on an artist's or a performer's success at home as well? I mean, what impact, in real terms, you can't work in the EU as much as you used to be able to, but what long-term impact does that have on someone's success here, Tom?
It might impact, for example, around commercial tours. So if they're no longer doing as many European dates, for example, or if they're choosing to avoid UK performers for any reason, then that might mean that some performers have less access to those productions when they're based in the UK. So, it might be Les Mis or Cats or all of those sorts of things. Some of those concerns around what it would mean to take that production on tour might affect who they hire as the principal in the UK.
Are you in any impact on your...
Yeah, in my experience, it has a particular impact on younger performers, particularly graduates, where often work in Europe can be a Kickstarter or a stepping stone into achieving work in the UK. We obviously know that the acting industry is very competitive, so getting into a West End show immediately is not always attainable. So I've had a lot of actors who've gone on to do a tour in Germany or, go to Austria or Vienna to do a job, and that is a first credit on the CV. And then suddenly when they're being submitted back in the UK, they're going, oh great, they've got this credit from, a credit in Germany is just as valuable as a credit in the UK, but sometimes it's just more attainable for young actors who maybe don't have the CV to back up a submission for a West End show to go and work overseas and then come back.
That makes sense, thank you. And then Matt?
Yeah, just to add to what Euan said, I think it's those things like summer seasons, which used to provide, a summer, a seasonal job for performers to both trade, both to hone their craft, but also to gain an income which sustains them long term in the industry. It's that access to those sorts of jobs that are also disappearing as well.
Okay, thank you, Damien.
Thank you. It would be super helpful if we could quantify this. So you've all said that there's less work, and it may be because people are being blocked out in the first place. It might be because of the complexity of paperwork. Is there any way of quantifying, either in days, in hours, in cash takings, in numbers of tours, numbers of performances of British artists and performers in continental Europe before and after leaving the European Union?
It's very difficult because it's a bit of an unknown, and it's about producer behaviour. I had a bit of a look at the ONS stats, which showed a 19% fall in exports of performing arts to Europe between 2016 and 2023. So the EU is the only place where we haven't recovered from the pandemic in terms of the amount of performing arts that we export. So that puts a kind of concrete cash figure, but in terms of the kind of work lost, it's just very difficult because individual producers are taking different decisions now all the time.
Okay, so it would be helpful to, I'm sure we have that ONS data, but it'd be helpful to perhaps follow up on that. Yep. You mentioned in Equity that you had a survey and half the members said that they had lost work. How did you conduct that survey?
Just by emailing our membership.
Was it by voluntary response, or was it sampled? Yes. So that is going to, yeah. You'd have to agree. I think that probably exaggerates because always when you ask a question and it's a voluntary response, you will always hear from people who feel most strongly about an issue rather than a representative sample. So it'd be helpful to get those actual numbers. Does any of you have experience of your members trying to get an Irish passport, for example?
There's definitely a feeling among our membership that if they can access an EU passport, that is a very positive thing to do for their career, yes.
And perhaps just for the to sort of set out the scene, could you just say what all the different requirements are perhaps Euan, in terms of visa requirements and social security requirements, all the different sort of levels of paperwork?
We don't, as agents, do the visa application for our clients. Often it is a deal point in negotiation where we would say it is the producer's responsibility to pay and apply for a visa. So often that falls on the producer to be able to provide that. What does then happen, though, is the producer provides it, and I have had an example before where a visa has been sorted for an actor, but the visa has ended before their exit date from the overseas territory. And I had a client, for example, call and say, I don't really know what to do. What happens if I turn up at the airport tomorrow? My visa has expired, and I get in trouble for that. So in terms of my experience in applying for visas, that's not part of my job or what I do for the clients. It's my job to make sure the producer is doing their job in terms of providing that for them. Sometimes a visa isn't applicable. Sorry. Sometimes a visa isn't applicable where, for example, a creative, a director or a choreographer might go out for 4 weeks to put up a show. So they use their 90-day sort of Schengen visa. But we've had examples where that 90-day cap has meant that they've had to turn down other opportunities because they've used up those 90 days for personal allowance plus work allowance, etc. And that's an example of loss of opportunity, loss of income, loss of job, because people have said, we want you to come and work for us, but they've said, I can't.
I wonder if any of the three of you could just sort of summarise what the difference is pre and post leaving the European Union in terms of sort of the volume of paperwork, of bureaucracy. I mean, bear in mind, of course, we were never a member of Schengen, so it may not be entirely obvious some of these things. But is anyone in a position to?
Every member state has its own particular system now.
Yeah.
So some might have visa waivers, but they might be based on particular definitions of what a performer is, particular eligibility, or for different durations of time. And of course, each member state has its own taxation arrangements. There's the question around the A1 forms, which I think we're going to get into. So it just increases the administration for every single site that a tour might want to go to. Whereas before, a UK touring commercial production could just deal with the EU as one section of its tour.
And how does it work in reverse? So for European domiciled performers coming to the UK, what's the difference in the regime?
I have an actress who's Dutch. I believe she might be on a global talent visa.
Working in
the UK, yeah. I actually took her on after she'd been working in the UK for a couple of years already. There are also actors, I think when you're applying for permanent leave to remain, you have to be in the UK or work in the UK for a certain number of days. I don't know the specifics of how many days that is to qualify, but it does mean that sometimes, when they are offered a job to go and tour somewhere, they can't say yes because they have to remain in the UK, etc. But again, I'm never involved in their application process, and often if an actor writes to me who's from Europe, I say you need to have the appropriate right to work documents in place for me to be able to represent you.
And moving back in the outbound to outbound, and maybe this is quite difficult to quantify, and I'm sure it would be different for different sectors, and of course every act is different. But we talk about the EU sometimes as if everybody's going to be visiting 28 different countries or 27 different countries on their tour, whereas I guess some just go to Germany. And maybe, so I guess the question is, if you're just going to one country, how different is it for that act compared to the pre-2016 or pre-2020 regime?
I mean,
yeah, so
what we're seeing now is a lot of UK-based commercial productions just choosing one European location, right, and then having a world tour and doing, say, Dublin as part of that world tour. Whereas before, you would have expected them to do multiple dates across multiple different member states. So that is quite a difference. But I guess the administration for one member state is obviously not as much of a burden because they're just dealing with one system, and that is the particulars of the visa regime of that member state.
Yeah. And you mentioned Dublin. How does the common travel area play into all of this?
Sorry, what's the common travel area?
Common travel area is the island of Ireland. Is for many different purposes in trade and movement of people and various health and social. I mean, lots of different ways. There are basically there are exceptions for the Republic of Ireland to many rules, and I just wondered how that for your band that are choosing Dublin, is that easy? Is it easier to choose Dublin than to choose Frankfurt?
Yes. In my experience, yes. I mean, often UK tours will have Dublin as one of their stops. I mean, the Bord Gosh Energy Theatre, I think, is one of the big theatres in Dublin. And as far as I'm aware, there is no requirement for any visas, etc. I have, though, that's in theatre. In television and film, I have had clients who've gone to film in Dublin. Dublin is a very popular place to film. A lot of work is filmed there, and an A1 form was required for that. Film and television work also is a much quicker turnaround than theatre work, where you are often self-taping and you've booked the job within a week of doing that first self-tape, and then suddenly you're filming in 2 weeks' time after that. So, the prospect of getting an A1 form in time of 3 weeks is just not going to happen.
Final question from me. Where do artists look to for guidance through this system? I mean, I'm sure they look to your august organisations, among others. But there's also, I guess there's also a question of governments or wider kind of arts organisations. And how, if at all, is that different between artists in Britain and in other countries?
I mean, there is a number of the Business and Trade Department have a number of country-by-country guides on the website which apply to each of those territories, and many of them, but not all of them, state the specific visa requirements or the waiver possibilities for those territories. Information on the Schengen visa is quite scant from the UK side, and on the EU side, some of the website doesn't. So it's difficult to find the information required, and certainly difficult to find it in one place as applies to a performer. And so that is difficult for performers to navigate, difficult for agents to navigate. Often, as Euan has said, that is done via the producer, and it's the reliance on the hirer to solve the visa problem. And as a result, it's easier for them not to have a visa problem to solve in order to facilitate the speed of the production. And if I can, just on the inbound side, in the back end of our report, in the glossary, we have gone through the kind of myriad different challenges faced by performers coming into the UK, the different creative visas, the fact you can work on a permitted paid engagement as a visitor, as well as the global talent visa that was mentioned. And that is also a kind of labyrinthine process to determine which of those is the correct way to come here to work.
Can I just go back to the Dublin point?
Yeah.
I think it's worth noting that the job in which an A1 form was required, he was being hired by an Irish company. Jobs where they have toured to Dublin and not required that, it's been a British UK company. Just thought that was important to know.
Well, it's hellishly complicated, isn't it? Let's just put a Vicky.
Thank you. We all know that the number of working class people working in the creative industries has dramatically decreased, and I thought it was quite interesting what you said about the impact in terms of young people being able to tour, and also in terms of the number of credits. So I'm just wondering, you might not have absolute evidence, but if you've got anything kind of anecdotally in terms of whether or not the challenges in terms of touring, etc., has had an impact in terms of bringing through the talent from working class communities to anyone.
We've seen a kind of decimation, really, of access from working class communities into our industries as a whole. I think there's been a 70% decline in working class performers in our industry, and it's hard to pinpoint exactly what the different drivers of that are. There are multiple, but I think the income impact of not being able to get that work from Europe is going to have a massive impact on the income of performers, and is therefore going to drive people out of the industry, especially those who don't have pre-existing wealth that they can rely on to smooth out those bumps.
I would say that when you're going to work in Europe, already there are costs that you're having to put forward, i.e., a lot of my actors have to employ accountants. Also, I think people forget that, yes, when actors are working on a job, performing or rehearsing, they're being paid, but they're self-employed, and a lot of their work is unpaid when they're having to keep up their practice or their singing lessons or things like that, and the point of me saying that is that a lot of their time is taken up with having to complete this paperwork or speak to accountants, be on calls to certain people, figure out what they can do, and that is a cost burden to them. The other thing as well is that a lot of actors don't get paid enough to live on just from working as an actor. I think the statistic was something like only 2% of actors actually earn enough to live just from doing acting. The other 98% all have to have some second job. Some of those are, waiting tables or working in hospitality. Some of them find good, nice online jobs or work from home jobs. And sometimes the prospect of working abroad means they can't find that second income or so easily be able to keep that second job. And sometimes they have to weigh up whether it's going to be affordable for them to do that.
I think part of the challenge, not just the kind of the wages and the access to opportunities, is the access to social capital that's required, and how that is concentrated in the middle class performance bracket. And that is what is required to access, the fact you need an accountant. Where can you go for help with the visa? How do you communicate with your agent? And improving access to social capital for working class performers is key for this, as well as it is key for improving their participation in the arts in general.
I think kind of what you're saying is that actually it's way before we actually get onto this that things need to change to make sure people do get that access.
45% of our members on the West End have a second job, the most prestigious part of the live performance sector.
Thank you. Cam.
Thanks, Chair. Good morning. Tom, what are the financial risks for UK actors working and touring in the EU since Brexit?
I think they have to make a series of very complicated judgments now about whether they want to take jobs that are offered to them, especially jobs that are kind of EU-based companies. The taxation system is very, very complicated. It's not always obvious so the source country applies tax to the wages that you get while you're on tour, and then you can claim that back through your self-assessment. But it's not always clear what the source country is going to apply tax to, and therefore what payment you're going to get at the end of the day, and what you're going to have to wait to get back from your self-assessment, whether you're going to get everything back through the self-assessment, etc., etc. So that's quite a big deal for people. Then there's the issue around the A1 forms, and people, we've had issues of opera singers where their payment has been withheld until they can submit the A1 form, which the current waiting period is 7 months to get out of HMRC. And then there's the kind of question of, well, should I take this job if I might get something in the UK that will be better paid or less complicated? There's a kind of judgment about, do you want to take an EU job and block out that time in your diary, or do you want to wait for something that might be easier? So it's a very complicated. I guess the final thing is also about calculation of the 90 days. Where do you want to kind of use your 90 days? Do you want to use it for work? Do you have a family member, for example, who's living in Europe you might need to care for? Is your partner have family in Europe that you might need to visit? So UK performers have to make these very, very difficult judgments, and often are agreeing to work where they don't know what they're actually going to get at the end of the day, and what implication it's going to have on their ability to work in Europe or in the UK in the future.
Yeah, it sounds as though, particularly if you don't have that money to put up front, that's quite a big gamble if you might be looking at 7 months to get paid.
Yeah, so I mean, for commercial tours, the UK producer will often meet the cost of accommodation, for example. So there's varying degrees of how much money a UK performer will have to put up at any one time. But I think actually the real question is, what are the earnings that I'm going to get back? So we had a member whose accommodation in a member state was taxed at source by that member state, even though it had been paid for by the producer. So they thought that they were going to pay tax on their earnings and their per diems, the daily living allowance that they get, and then they find that they've actually had the accommodation treated as a benefit in kind by the source country. So instead of getting £600 a week, they've suddenly found they got £300 a week, for example. And there's also that arrangement is different in every single EU member state that they might be working.
Euan, Matt, did you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I've actually got an example payslip in front of me. I mean, looking here, this artist's total gross income of 1 month was about €4,170, and in total they've been taxed, social security. They also paid this is Austrian withholding tax and something that's called like an artist pension tax, which is basically a benefit for artists to use when they're out of work. But obviously, as a UK actor, when you're working there, you don't really see that benefit because you're coming back to the UK, so you're not sort of reaping the benefits of what that pension is. It's also a compulsory thing you have to pay, and if you want to get that money back, you have to pay into it for a year before you can get it back. So if you're doing a 6-month job, you have to carry on paying 6 months worth of contributions even after you finish the job to be able to get that money refunded back to you.
Right, during which you might be out of work.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
All I'd add is that the A1 certificate is required per country, so it isn't as simple as a one A1 that covers all of Europe. You need to get one for each territory, and if the territories in which you're going to work in alter during the tour, you're not going to get that in time, even if you had time to get it in the first place. So it just adds to the complication.
Thank you. Tom, you already mentioned that it can take 7 months to process the A1 forms. How common is it for performers working in the EU to have to be unpaid, to have a delay to their pay?
We have had that a lot from members, especially that's a real issue that has come through our singers committee, so especially around opera. That they just have, we've had a series of complaints where members have had their total pay withheld until they can provide the form. So often they go and do the work and then they're waiting for several months for the money to actually come through.
Euan and Matt, did you have anything to add to that response?
On the A1 forms, they don't accept digital copies. It needs to be a physical copy. So there's also an added delay there where you need to try and get the physical copy to these companies. I also want to add on the cost implications. Almost all actors have agents as representation, and they have to pay a commission to these agents for doing the work. So on top of all these taxes and on top of all these withholding taxes that they're having to pay, they're also paying a 12.5% commission to agents to help them manage these jobs and go through these pay slips and do this for them, which is also a commission on their gross payment, not their net payment. So that's an added thing that is being taken off their wages.
Yeah, thank you. How often do actors have to turn down EU work simply because they can't afford it? To Euan, and then as follows.
It's difficult because there's an element of not desperation, but actors want to work. They really want to work. But sometimes they have to balance whether they want to do it over the affordability of being able to do it. So I would say yes, I have had actors turn down jobs because it's just not feasible or affordable for them. Also, sometimes I've had actors who have been working away in Europe who've then come back and said, I never want to do that again because it's just not enjoyable for me. There's too much paperwork, there are too many hurdles and loops and things to go through. Actors have walked midway through a contract, they've just gone, I actually can't afford this anymore. And so, and then, that has a trickle-on effect to the producers and the rest of the cast. If, cast members are walking midway through a contract, they can't put on the show, So, yeah, again, I can't quantify how often that happens or how many times that happens, but in my experience, it does happen.
Is there any support to performers that are sort of jumping through those hurdles, either from your organisations or elsewhere?
I try where possible to help as much, but again, my experience only goes so far in terms of what I can tell them. I'm not a tax specialist. I always advise getting an accountant. Again, that's an added expense for them to do. So, I try where possible, but, I work for a company and, I have a boss telling me we can't be liable for telling them something that might end up not being correct. We always say we advise you to speak to a tax specialist about this. So, yeah.
Matt?
More than 4/5 of those who responded to our call for evidence reported that they were aware it was more expensive post-Brexit, the whole process of going through the visa applications and the paperwork to get to work in Europe. Those are those that are aware of it, and there are many more that are kind of protected by their agents, by others, from the realisation of the costs of it. I think the real challenge is that people do not have the opportunity to turn down work. And so they will go for work even when it is cost prohibitive. And often we'll see the charities in our sector, the benevolent funds and others who will step in to support performers when they're suffering hardship. But our organisation is not able to provide that support, that financial support directly.
Thank you. Tom?
I mean, a major source of income for our opera singers used to be short-term cover. So if a principal was ill in, say, a house in Italy, one of our opera singers would get a very quick last-minute call saying, we've got a sick principal, can you immediately come over and cover the role for a week or whatever it was? And what we're increasingly seeing is that just the administrative complexities make that very, very difficult. So it's less about affordability, but more about people saying, oh, hold on a minute, can we actually do everything that needs to be done to facilitate that performer to come over for a short period of time? We had one instance where someone had actually ended up in a correspondence with the Italian embassy about doing one night in Italy, and had a letter from the Italian embassy that she took over and showed at the border and eventually managed to get the job for one night. But that's the sort of level that people are going to try and understand whether they're actually legally allowed to do the job or not.
Can I just add one more thing? I can only speak on behalf of my company, Global Artists, but we an unwritten rule, I guess, that we always take the equity minimum rates in the UK as the base rate of pay to take a full 12.5% commission. I have had clients who are being paid less than that in Europe. I think it's €350 per week for rehearsals and €450 per week for performances. And in that instance, we calculate the difference between the equity minimum, which I think is 560 something, and we reduce our commission rate to reflect that reduce. So that's just an example of what our companies sometimes do to help with the cost implications, but that then has a trickle-on effect on agents' income and how much the business, our agency as a business, is taking. I don't know what other agencies do in those situations, but that's just an example of how we try and help financially.
Thanks, Chair.
Thanks, Cam. Let's move on to Rupert, please.
Thanks, Chair, and thanks, everyone. I just wondered what effects the barriers to working in the EU are having on the performance arts sector as a whole. Anyone who wants that? Is it shrinking, contracting, expanding?
I don't know if it, again, I don't, I'm just going off what you said before, I don't know if it's I don't know if opportunities are reducing. I think it's actors not seeing the opportunity, not being able to have the opportunity before. You know, it's not that the work is becoming it's not that the work is, you know, there's less and less work. It's that actors just aren't even able to do the work from the first point of whatever it is, because, you know, it's either not affordable, they don't have a European passport, etc. So I think it's less about the quantity of work that is being produced and more about how accessible and easy it is for actors to do that work.
I mean, we used to have a great competitive advantage in that we were the only native English nation with frictionless opportunities on the continent. And since the administration for our performers, you know, our talent has increased, it broadens the labour market to open up to Australia or America or Canadian performers, all of whom are treated as third countries. So we've, in a way, you know, destroyed our own competitive advantage by reducing the frictionless ease by which UK talent could be contracted from Europe.
So it's an act of self-harm. We've shot ourselves in the foot.
I mean, I think our members would see it that way, yes.
I mean, you're an agent, and Matt, one for you as well. What does this restricted access to the EU market mean for the career path of agents, casting directors, other industry professionals?
I mean, speaking from personal experience, again, I can't speak on behalf of other agents, but a lot of my income comes from actors working overseas, and I would never force or make an actor do a job they don't want to do. I actively encourage actors to do work they want to do that serves them creatively and that is affordable to them. You know, I recognise they have a life, they have bills to pay, etc. So yeah, I mean, in terms of the effect on, I don't know what the effect is on casting directors specifically, but in terms of agents, you know, if actors can't afford to work in the EU, you know, that's a huge market of in the entertainment industry that we can't access, and therefore, you know, losing income in that respect. And it makes it more competitive in the UK. You know, actors can't work in Europe. Okay, fine, they need to find work in the UK. suddenly the pool of actors looking for work in the UK grows. Also, we spoke before about people coming into the UK to work. I know we're sort of more going to the west side now, but there is a huge influx of American actors coming to the UK at the moment because of what's going on politically there, and also because of the Broadway economy. I mean, there was something like only two Broadway musicals made money, like recouped their finances in the last year. I mean, the Broadway economy is failing in terms of how that's working. So actors are moving to the UK because more work is starting in the UK, which is great because it's cheaper to do. But that means that more actors from America and Europe are coming into the UK to have those opportunities, which means some UK actors go, well, great, I'll go to Europe. But, obviously it's becoming more difficult to do that.
Have you got less EU clients on your books because it's too complicated to have you as their agent now?
I have had meetings with European clients where the first thing I always have to say is, can you work in the UK? Do you have the right to work? And they go, no, I'm trying to figure it out. And I go, I can't do anything for you unless you can. We're finding that some producers are now doing right to work checks before people are even allowed to audition. Before they've even been offered the job, so it's just not something that we can even consider. So yes, I have had to say no to representing actors because they've not had the right documents to work in the UK.
I think on the casting side, what we've discovered in the conversations that we've had is where the casting director is the expert in the talent pool in Britain and Ireland, and usually was the European productions that would come to that casting director and ask them to find the best talent from these islands to go and work on European projects. And since Brexit, those casting directors are not being approached. Casting directors in Europe are being approached to find talent based in Europe who are able to perform in English, in native English, and those opportunities are being solely kind of put out on the continent. And so we have seen casting directors who use the Spotlight service reporting that their income is halving, that they've lost multiple jobs due to Brexit, and that those jobs are going overseas. I mean, occasionally those casting directors will still look at the British talent pool, but as a preference they're casting from the continent and for people who are already cleared to work in Europe, and the casting director is also caught in that as well.
What about the talent pipeline? I mean, I used to be in academia before all this, and we've had reports from drama schools that they're not getting EU entrance anymore because it's a third country. The fees have ballooned up. They're now classed as international students, and especially the smaller drama schools. I've got one in my seat. What effect has Brexit had on the talent pipeline to people coming through the system?
It's certainly something that drama schools have reported. They're finding it much harder to attract students from the EU. There's a loss of income for them. There's also a loss of the diversity of the pool of students that are coming in, and there's a loss of that learning going back into those EU nations, and the kind of great world-class British drama system and training that we have is not therefore being dispersed back into the EU talent pool. But there is a financial loss of opportunity. Those drama students that came from Europe before were assisted to do so. Now they are coming in as you said, as third-party students, and the fees are no longer attractive to bring them in.
We've been running a campaign around Bristol Old Vic Theatre School, which, due to the changes, is having a really, really hard time making the numbers add up. It's one of the most prestigious drama schools we've had. It was Sir Daniel Day-Lewis, Olivia Colman, lots of very well-known alumni, and they're really thinking about whether they can continue with the kind of more public model.
And then last one from me, I'm having a flashback to the 1st of April 2022. In this very committee we had the really useful theatre group, and it sort of caused headlines, some evidence of theirs. The Daily Express headline, Brexit fury as EU Phantom of the Opera tour coming from China. So the evidence we were given is it's actually cheaper to take a Phantom of the Opera production from China into the EU, despite the distance, because it's only one point of entry and it's just a lot less red tape. I mean, we're having a reset now. Is any of that, do you foresee that fixing? And if things carry on like they are, are there really serious long-term implications for the industry? So would that situation still arise today, this crazy thing that made all the headlines back in the day? And how can we fix it?
I don't know about the China example specifically. I think, as I say, what we're seeing is UK producers reducing the number of dates they're doing in Europe, which means less work for our members, and we're seeing EU-based producers overlooking UK talent.
Is there another anomalous example you could cite us today of this sort of madness, that distance and red tape are all clashing here?
Not an obvious example. I would say that I have noticed an increase in the amount of work that is now going further overseas outside of Europe. I think producers are finding it easier now to take productions to Dubai. There's a huge growth in Dubai in terms of work there. I've got productions going to Delhi and Mumbai in India, China, Japan, all these places. There's a huge big Les Mis world tour happening at the moment, and almost all of the dates are Singapore, Manila, etc. They've done very few European dates. I think they've got a few in London, then they're going off to New York, and that's it. So I have noticed that producers are producing work a lot less in overseas territories, particularly British producers. Often the work in European overseas territories, often the work that is happening in Europe are German promoters or German producers, for Germany, for example. But yeah, I think that's what I would say.
More in the film and television era, I think, where what we're seeing is productions that could have been based in the UK are basing themselves in Ireland because they have access to both the UK and the EU markets if they're based there, and that's particularly attractive. And you see things like Wednesday, the second season, went to Ireland from Romania, did not come to the UK, and that's part of the attraction is the ability to work across both markets.
Wednesday, the Netflix thing.
Second season moved from Eastern Europe to Ireland.
We went to the animation studio where a little sequence of it was filmed exactly a week ago, did we not? Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks.
In Ireland.
Thank you very much. And finally, we're going to Liz, please.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning to you. Apart from rejoining the EU, what solutions would you recommend to the challenges we have discussed today? If I can ask that first to Tom.
I think the buzzword for me is just standardisation. That might be that the UK government does a deal with the EU Commission that's EU-wide, or it might be that they continue doing a kind of multilateral standardisation of the kind of terms by which UK talent can work across the member states. And, we have different sectors have a lot more output in different parts of Europe. So it could even be that the UK government looks at dancers, most of the work was in Belgium and Germany. Why don't we try and figure out how we can have some kind of standardisation in that area? We're very pro the visa waiver policy asks that have been put forward by multiple campaigns. But that isn't the be-all and end-all. There are lots of steps that the UK government could be taking in a kind of multilateral way in advance of a big deal.
Euan?
Yeah, I would agree. I think standardisation in terms of tax treaties, etc. I obviously know that the UK has tax treaties with European countries, but standardisation across the whole of Europe would help in terms of the paperwork, etc. that comes with that. I think the other thing as well is the freedom of movement. I think the 90-day cap is such a restriction, and I think visa requirements, etc. Are restricting young actors from taking opportunities and growing careers. So I think that's another key point as well.
How quickly could opportunities for UK actors resume if the government and EU Commission agreed to visa waiver for performers?
Well, opportunities would grow instantly because it would eliminate the need for an EU passport or a European passport. Suddenly anyone with a British passport can go and do these jobs. So it's more about opening up these opportunities that have had to close because of the restriction of movement to British passport holding actors.
Matt, can I ask you what engagement you've had with the government about improving the ability of UK actors to work in the EU?
We've had very little engagement with the government around that question. We wanted to bring our thoughts to this committee first, and so that's been our approach on that matter.
Okay.
Have you tried? Or they not want
We've had a number of meetings with the British government and different departments on various subjects, but not around Brexit.
We've also found it very, very difficult to get the level of engagement that we had hoped for in advance of the EU summit. We've written on A1 forms and found it very, very difficult to get a reply, to be honest. So we'd hoped for much more.
The government has stated that it has no intention of rejoining Creative Europe. Why should ministers change their minds?
I mean, Creative Europe has been a great success and has been a great success across Europe for those EU countries who are part of it in terms of both the cultural exchange and the financial benefits of the industry as well. One of the things that Spotlight supports is the EFP in Berlinale, which is happening in 2 weeks' time. It was a programme where British performers such as Daniel Craig were first brought out into the international spotlight. And as a result of leaving Creative Europe, the UK is no longer part of EFP, and our up-and-coming performers are no longer able to be promoted on the international stage in Berlinale. So from a very individual level, we see that opportunity of international exposure has been removed. But it also, as I said earlier, the cultural exchange between nations that is so vibrant within the performing arts is denied when we're not part of a body across Europe that promotes that dialogue.
And if I can just ask my first question to you, what solutions would you like to see to the challenges we've discussed today?
A more generous and a more consistent Schengen visa waiver for the performing arts is important. In the meantime, having a consistent source of advice for the performing arts around the visa situation that is easily accessible is vital, I think, because that just, again, is excluding people from the social capital of knowing what is going on. And when it comes to students, I mean, there's obviously very welcome movements in terms of the Erasmus scheme and how we're going to improve mobility of students. But further advances can be made in making sure that there are opportunities for EU students to study in the UK and to continue that cultural exchange as well.
Thanks, Liz. Ken?
Thanks, Chair. Just coming back in on the visa waiver. What's our offer to the EU? What's the incentive for the EU to engage our government on that? To anybody who might want to take that on.
My understanding is we have relatively generous terms at the moment, and that broadly most EU artists can come over for up to 3 months, depending on the particulars. So in terms of reciprocal arrangements, I think that we're already offering fairly good terms. So it's really just, as I say, about ensuring that each of those member states is treating our talent in the same way and offering that level of kind of openness and flexibility, really.
I can't comment too much on the politics of it because I don't know fully what that is. But what I will say is, I went to drama school myself. That's how I sort of got into this industry. And I trained with a lot of European American actors. And speaking with them, they viewed the UK as a cultural icon in terms of theatre. You've got Shakespeare, the Globe, and we do have some of the best colleges and training institutions in the world. Working on the West End, I mean, the glitz and the glamour of that, do you know what I mean? You, I think work in London and in the UK can put you on a global, can lift your profile to a global scale much more than working in Europe. I think what Europe brings and the performing work in Europe is a career stepping stone and a platform to start building credits. But ultimately, people see Hollywood and London as the two peaks of career. So, in terms of what we can offer, I think it's working in the UK and building that career. And, a lot of work is being filmed in Pinewood, etc. as well. We've got big institutions that offer brilliant work.
If it is the case that the UK's visa waiver for creative workers is generous, it's not the feeling of performers in Europe either, who do see it difficult to get work in the UK. And certainly when we've been in Spain and in Germany recently talking to performers there, they feel the avenues to come here are closed off to them. So even if it is a matter of communicating better what those opportunities are, I think the EU countries and certainly the performers in the EU countries that we've spoken to would welcome the reciprocal nature being extended to them.
Please.
I mean, European audiences want our talent. I mean, we've been a world leader for a long time, and UK talent is without par, really, in the world. Incredible skills and training, incredible experiences. So that there is a strong incentive, I believe, on the other side for them to be open to us, just purely on the basis that is what people want. They want the amazing British director, UK director. They want the amazing UK principal. So I think that we have a strong basis just on the basis of what the workforce can offer, really. And that's actually why, as I gather, in the past, it seems like the EU have been fairly willing to be reasonable about this when it was discussed the first time around.
Thank you. Thanks, Chair.
Cameron. That's the point, isn't it? I think that it feels to me like actually if the government were to start engaging in a series of kind of bilateral conversations about cultural agreements with other EU nations, that they would be pushing it an open door. I think we've got quite a lot to offer in exchange for that. Do you get the sense, and it sounds like you haven't had the opportunity to have many in-depth conversations with the government on this, but do you get the sense that the government should be doing more to kick off those bilateral conversations and to start talking about whether we can do bilateral cultural agreements over, over how this could work better, more smoothly?
It seems like that would be a politically feasible route, and it doesn't mean that you're going to be accused of trying to reopen negotiations that happened in the past, etc. So it seems to me that there's a lot of scope for that to be taking place. I'm not involved, so whether they feel that is happening already or not, I don't know. But I think there's a lot of scope.
Do you agree?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, again, I don't know too much about the politics of it all, just in terms of what my profession is. But, I know that there are visa treaties or visa agreements with countries. I know there's one with South Korea, that it feels like there are options open to us, and I feel like maybe more could be done to open those conversations to explore what those options are.
Do you agree?
I think the challenge that our sector faces is that we often fall between different ministries, and so whereas DCMS may understand that cultural and economic impact, maybe business and trade does not, and so it is not as simple as talking to one part of government. And whereas the economic value of our sector is so huge, but is also underappreciated at times, and we have to, as a sector, make sure that economic and cultural value is well articulated.
Yeah, and there's also the kind of additional issue that where a DCMS may be your kind of anchor government department in the sense that they're supposed to champion you. Kind of international cultural agreements need to be negotiated by the Department for Business and Trade or even the Foreign Office, right? So it's about that kind of silo working, which we all know government is famous for. Vicky?
Euan, you said again about a career stepping stone into credits in terms of working in Europe. And one of the worries that I have is, I asked the question earlier in terms of access for working class people into this. If they can't get into there to be able to have the career stepping stone, what more can and should we be doing? And just a question for all of you in terms of making sure that doors are open for working class people in these industries.
Yeah, I mean, it makes it much harder for them. I mean, I work with casting directors all the time, and I speak to them and I go, what is it you look for when you're looking at someone's spotlight or you're trying to call someone in for a job? And I talk about currency. They need to be looking as if they are working. If you've got a gap in your CV from 2022 to 2026, they're going, well, why haven't you worked? What was the gap there? Why aren't you booking jobs? And sometimes that European work is that gap, it's that stepping stone, it's building those credits. Cruises are the same thing. Sometimes a cruise on a Royal Caribbean or something like that. But there are cost implications of those. So yes, it's having effect on working class actors who maybe can't afford to do those jobs. What can we be doing to help? I mean, making it easier for them, putting it simply, you spoke about a support line or help to sort of understand taxation and how that works overseas, etc. I mean, you also mentioned earlier that sometimes these European jobs, most of the time, they do offer per diems and they do offer accommodation, etc., which makes you go, oh, great, maybe that is affordable because I'm not having to pay rent. But obviously, sometimes there's a taxation on that because they treat it as a benefit. I think it is making it harder for working class actors to break into the industry, particularly from graduating. If you've done 2 years, 3 years out of drama school, it makes you just go, do you know what, I'm going to sack it off, I'm going to go do something else.
I mean, our opera singers are some of our most working class members. You can either sing or you can't. It doesn't matter who your dad is. And they are actually most reliant on touring between different European houses and EU being hired by European-based companies in different houses across Europe to come and sing for them. So actually there's a real kind of dynamic there where some of our most working class members are the most proportionately affected by what's happened, especially in opera. Yeah.
The general situation around how we get more working class people into the performing arts is around the outputs from working in this sector. The cost of entry into the sector compared to other professions or other trades are comparably low. There is definitely an issue around access to social capital, about how people find their pathways in our sector. But it would be disingenuous to bring more people from working class backgrounds into the arts when there are not sustainable careers for them, where there are not enough opportunities and where wages are not high enough. And I think we really are serious about making sure there's long-term sustainable careers for people from working class backgrounds in the arts. It's around making sure that careers pay properly and sustainably, and that ensures long-term participation.
Where's live performance in the industrial strategy, for example? How does Arts Council reform speak to this? What's happening with the decline of regional theatres? We're seeing regional theatres really in steep decline, actually. There's something like, I think there's 43 on the Theatres in Trust Theatres at Risk register. So there's, what we're discussing here is actually part of this wider ecosystem, and especially in the live performance, that's an ecosystem that is increasingly in decline.
Thank you very much. Can I thank you all for your time and for appearing in front of us today? Was there any final messages that you need to, that are burning with you, that you need to leave with the committee before we allow you to escape?
I just wanted to say about theatre and education, which we haven't mentioned today, and that was UK performers being tasked with going and delivering English language theatre education in European schools and other education institutions. It was a huge part of our members' income, and it's been absolutely decimated as a result of the changes. Yeah. One company, White Horse Productions, is saying that they have got half the work now, and as a result they've reduced their company by half.
Thank you. Euan?
No, I don't think I do have anything to further to say.
You've landed all your messages. Well done.
Yeah.
Matt?
I just want to thank you again, Chair, and the committee for taking up this important topic of Brexit and in your State of Play programme.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you all for your time today. We're now going to take a very short break while we bring in our next panel.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Order. Welcome to our second panel this morning, and for this panel we're going to be looking at the impact of Brexit on the music sector in terms of touring the EU, and we're joined by Hanna Madalska-Gayer, I hope I'm saying that correctly, Hanna, who's Head of Policy and Communications at the Association of British Orchestras. We're joined by Kate Nash, Brit Award-winning recording artist, musician and actor, and by Naomi Pohl, who's the General Secretary of the Musicians Union. You're all very welcome. Thank you for joining us today. Look, before we start, Naomi, there is some really complicated terminology associated with the transport and mobility of goods and other things which maybe people watching at home might be unfamiliar with. So can you give us the kind of 1-minute explainer of terms like cabotage, carnet and sites, so we're all familiar with all of that malarkey before we kick off, please? Thank you.
Absolutely. I think the music industry, we had to kind of get our heads around this quite quickly because these were words that we'd never used prior to Brexit because these rules just didn't apply to our members. So cabotage rules essentially are about transporting freight around from territory to territory, and the cabotage rules mean that you can only make 3 stops in the EU before you have to return to the UK. So this affects orchestral tours, for example, when they're transporting instruments and equipment. ATA carnets were the stuff of legend when I first started working at the Musicians Union because they were something that musicians had to deal with long ago, and now they're back in effect in Europe. Basically, if you're going on tour, you have to list all of your equipment in a carnet in order to take it with you. You have to pay for it, and you have to put down a security deposit, which is usually 30 or 40% of the value of the equipment. So you don't have to do this if you've got a portable instrument. You can take a guitar and an amp, hopefully on foot or in a van. But for large amounts of equipment, bands and all of their kit, they have to list it all. CITES is the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species. So this relates particularly to musical instruments that contain things like ivory and rosewood that are protected species. You have to have a musical instrument certificate if you've got a musical instrument that contains some of those endangered species. And currently those are free to get, but the government's been looking at introducing a cost for those, which we're very much against. EORI numbers are Economic Operators Registration and Identification numbers, which is related to merchandise. So if you're taking T-shirts with you on tour or you want to sell CDs, then you need an EORI number. There's also rules of origin, which relates to merchandise, which is about where the products were actually made. So if you have a T-shirt that was made in China, but it was printed up in the UK, the rules of origin say that you treat it like Chinese merchandise effectively. So if you've got a T-shirt that's manufactured in the EU, then it can freely move around the EU without all the burden of red tape, basically. So there's probably more terminology and acronyms that might come up, but they're the main ones, I think.
Brilliant. Thank you for kicking us off, because I think that just gives us a bit of an idiot's guide to how to some of the terminology that we're going to be cantering through in the next 60 minutes. Kate, can I kick off with you? Yes. Why are we here? Why are we discussing this? What are the benefits to musicians in being able to tour the EU? Why do you want to do it?
I have a lot to say about this.
Okay, good.
On a personal front and professional. So I think personally, being able to tour in other countries has helped me develop my skills as a performer. I think performing in other countries makes you a more dynamic performer. There's a cultural exchange that I think is really important. It gives me context for a wider world. I'm able to learn from others in their place of work. Also, I think that British culture, we like to see ourselves as sort of the centre of being like at the cutting edge of music. That's never more present than at festivals like Glastonbury, and I think historically we've been celebrated around the world for like our contribution to music. And being able to tour and have opportunities to profit from tour in other countries around the world, including Europe, if we have less opportunities to do that, I think we're at risk of losing that reputation, that status, that sense of pride in our culture. And also I think it will have a knock-on effect on the UK economy. And I can tell you why I think that there's a direct link there. But the more we limit artists in this sense, the more that we limit UK culture on a global scale. I think, that I see music as a source of joy, and I like to spread joy around the world. I think there's validity to that. I've seen people grow in confidence at shows. I've seen people find communities in cities that they don't necessarily have their own community. I believe in diversity being a positive thing, and I think becoming more worldly has informed me and made me a smarter, more sensitive, more empathetic person and a better employer. I also see music as a work and as work and as a job. It is my job. I'm a working musician, and touring in Europe and growing my fan base there has in the past been profitable for me, and is less profitable for me now. It's much more difficult for me to make a profit in Europe and in the UK as a touring artist. And touring does build fan bases. So when people come to my show and see me as a live artist, whether they were already interested in my music, or maybe they've come with a friend, maybe they've seen me at a festival, that grows me as a live artist, but also as a recorded artist. My recorded work is more listened to around the world, which is why I'm sort of linking, there is a direct link, and it is an ecosystem between recorded work and live work. When we go out and tour, we're promoting our recorded music. We're actually promoting UK culture. I have contributed significantly to UK culture. I think we could all agree. I've won a Brit Award. I've made the company Universal a lot of money. I still make them a lot of money to this day, even though I'm not signed to them anymore. And if I had not toured my first record made of bricks, there's no way that impact would have been as significant. I make the streaming companies money, even though my share of the profits, in my opinion, are too low and unethical. And these companies are major companies in the UK. They make a huge contribution to the UK economy. And if people around the world, including in Europe, cannot see us live, and we lose the ability to promote ourselves, those streaming numbers will go down. And I think that will have a negative impact on the UK economy. Music, I think, brings in roughly, the last figure I read was about 8 billion a year to the economy, so that's significant. And I think the ethics of recorded music is relevant to this, because we are paid so unfairly for our recorded music, and we were told for a long time that was okay because we made money from touring. Well, now it's really difficult for us to make money from touring. The last European tour that I went on, I lost, I think, 26 grand. And the last UK tour that I went on, I lost about 13 grand. 6 days before the tour in Europe, I had to let go of a crew member. It was around Christmas. I felt terrible about this. But I was doing everything I could to cut costs, which I also really dislike as an employer, because I don't want to do anything to sacrifice the integrity of my show. I think, having been an artist for 20 years, having the success that I do, the fan base that I do, selling thousands of tickets, having millions of streams, I'm within my rights to protect that integrity. And just to make it really simple, I wish I could fly across the stage like a Beyonce or something, but I can't. If I had the budget, I would. But to me, the integrity of my show comes down to having 3 band members, a drummer, bassist, guitarist, a sound engineer, a lighting engineer, a tour manager, a guitar tech, who's someone who'll be on stage in case anything goes wrong during the show. I think that's pretty integral. Sometimes a photographer, and that's it. And that causes extreme losses on the road in 2025, which is like when I was last touring. I think that music should not be exclusive. I think it's for all. And it does become an issue of class. Becomes an issue of race, gender, sexuality and identity, because the doors are fast closing on who can choose to take such a financial risk. That's really real. If a younger, newer artist doesn't already have disposable income, I really don't understand how they would be able to do shows in the UK, let alone shows in Europe. I think there's a pipeline that we're not really thinking through about the future of UK music, about how we're actually seen culturally around the world. And I think that going to tour in Europe, to have cultural exchange, to develop our talent, our skill, I would not be the artist I am today had I not done 20 years of touring. And, you know, now the only reason it's possible for me to keep doing that, even though I have Made of Bricks in my catalogue, is I sell pictures of my bum on the internet. I started an OnlyFans account during my last touring cycle to get some attention on the issue, which it did. I was in every newspaper in the country, because I think I myself and a lot of artists are quite sick of screaming into the void about how difficult it is. So I'm so grateful to be here and to be included in this conversation, because I'm really, really passionate about what I do. And I think music is really important. I'm sure you do as well. I think most people do. And I think that anything that we can do to make it easier to put on shows in Europe will make a significant difference. And I hope that I can help explain, you know, what's behind that on this entire broken ecosystem, and why Brexit has also made some things more difficult. And if we could, you know, find some solutions, that would really be helpful. Because it's extremely difficult right now for artists.
Thank you for setting it out so beautifully for us. Naomi, can I just turn to you as well? I mean, can you just quantify for us? I mean, Kate's given us a great description of how the opportunities have changed for her, but in terms of musicians across the board, how have you seen opportunities to tour and earn a living change since Brexit?
So I've got some stats from a survey that we did of our members in 2024. So 75% of respondents who'd previously worked in the EU prior to Brexit had seen a decline in their income. 59% said the EU touring was no longer viable for them. 54% said merchandise sales had been affected. And a UK music survey showed that 82% of musicians who responded to that said income had decreased. So it's had a massive impact on our members. I think it's it's not just about touring, although that is a massive part of this. Also, we've had a musician prior to Brexit was sending us postcards from each territory she was working in as a freelance orchestral musician. So there's people who actually go and like pick up one-off gigs, or might go and just work for a couple of weeks for an orchestra or an opera company in Europe. That they used to be able to do that, and it's very, very difficult for them to do that now, because it might be that they're working across multiple territories doing different gigs for different engagers. So there's been a huge kind of depressing reduction in that kind of work. In fact, one musician told me last week that an orchestra he used to work for in Europe now say they won't take you for work if you've got a UK passport. So it's like had a very, very direct impact on him. And as we've talked about, it's the talent pipeline as well, because if you are a working class band, prior to Brexit, you could just sling your gear in the back of the van, you could take some T-shirts to sell, you didn't have to deal with the red tape, you didn't have to deal with the extra costs, and you could just go and tour in Europe and build up your audience. And also, if you find on streaming platforms that you've got niche music which has actually got a really strong kind of appeal in Germany, you could find your fans and you could go and tour, go and see them. And it's much, much harder for artists to do that now. And as Kate said, it's really hard to tour domestically too. So unfortunately, there's lots of downward pressures on our members' careers.
Yeah. Thank you. Cam.
Thank you, Chair. Kate, how are musicians making up for loss of income and that experience and exposure that touring in the EU brings?
Well, as I said, I'm selling pictures of myself on the internet on OnlyFans. Without doing that, I chose to do that because it also got a lot of media attention. Yeah,
you mentioned that was about attention, but it's also about recouping the money.
Genuinely needing the finances, yeah. I was on tour. I was promoting a record, and my album had come out that year. I had a North American tour, a European tour, and a UK tour. And I described touring a little bit like building, I suppose, where you're sort of like, this is how much it's going to cost. And obviously live events and things that happen can change the budget as you go. And I think I didn't really believe how dire the situation was. But after being on the road for a while and sort of doing the numbers, I had, I think, 5 days in between two tours. And I was really stressing about, how am I going to pay all of my invoices before Christmas? Really, because of all these sort of like additional factors and things that can come, into play, because of how much the landscape has changed. And I thought, I can't really get an acting job in 5 days and shoot something. I'm doing my actual job, which is where I'm supposed to be earning the money and being able to pay for this. I'm streaming millions of, streams, and it doesn't add up. And so I thought this is something I could do quite quickly, make an impact, talk about the problem, and financially it really did help me. I know people that are selling all of their instruments, selling their things in their home, selling furniture, picking up second and third jobs if they can. You might not be able to if you're on tour. I don't know how you could work another job, unless it's something like OnlyFans. And if you have disposable income already because of privilege, then you're more likely to be able to take the financial hit. But if you don't, you can't go on tour. And sometimes I'll be offered a gig in Europe, a festival, for example, and it just doesn't, I can't say yes because I'll just lose money doing it, and I just can't do that all the time.
Yeah. It's costing you jobs in the EU and in the UK?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Can I just add a little bit to the red tape? Because I think sometimes when you complain about red tape, it sounds like, we all have to do red tape. I don't mind doing red tape and forms, and I have to do that a lot in my job, and I have people that I employ that are really good at that. I think it can make a difference if you're on tour and the red tape holds you up. I mean, literally, if there's a delay with a carnet, you could miss a show and then miss a complete fee, and then the entire tour is in jeopardy. So it's not just we don't want to do forms. We are capable of doing forms. If we're not, we employ people that can do them for us. But it can actually affect the entire budget of the tour and make the tour even more difficult or impossible. Or you're cutting crew members, and that's another thing to think about. Is there's a lot of jobs in this industry. It's not just artists. I employ musicians, I employ sound engineers, lighting engineers. I have managers. I have manager, agent, lawyer, accountant. It's we're having to cut corners wherever we can, let go of people, and think about who we can even share the profit with. So I think it's already impacting a lot of people's jobs, and will continue to get worse if we don't find any helpful solutions and make things easier.
Thanks, Kate. Naomi, Kate mentioned some of those roles that support artists. What are the implications, as you see them, for those that support the artists, musicians, engineers, etc.?
Well, it's a huge problem. I mean, we had a meeting with a theatre producer who showed us a spreadsheet that they had where they were counting the 90 days in 180 for all of the crew as well as for the performers. And we've heard about Robbie Williams having to after 90 days of touring in Europe, having to send his whole crew back to the UK and then pick up a second crew to go and do the rest of the tour, which is just crazy. And if you've got that gig working on a Robbie Williams tour, you want to be able to do the full tour. You don't want to be in a position where you have to come back and try and find another job halfway through. So that is completely crazy. But yeah, it's just the theatre producer we spoke to, they said that they'd had to tell crew members not to take a holiday in Europe because it would use up some of the 90 days potentially, and they're literally counting them down, and they have to send people back when the 90 days are hit. So it's definitely reduced opportunities for crew. And also, I think US productions would sometimes come to the UK because you'd get access not just to the UK but also to all of Europe, and you could use UK talent, but also you could bring in crew from Europe if you wanted to. Obviously that's not possible now. So I think it does make the UK less attractive as a destination for productions.
Thank you. Hanna, anything to add?
I would echo a lot of what Naomi and Kate have expressed. Obviously, I'm speaking on behalf of the Association of British Orchestras, so we're talking about large-scale touring with large groups of people, so the costs are multiplied. We have statistics from 2019, so pre-Brexit, which showed that 77% of tours by UK orchestras were to the EU. It's our closest and our largest market, and that's the same case for orchestras as it is for gigging musicians. Chair, you asked why are we here? That is why we're here, because we're talking about our biggest market, which is being made much more difficult and expensive for us to access. Since Brexit came into force, since January 2021, we've seen an 8% decline in earned income for UK orchestras from touring, and we've seen a 9% decline in overseas performances. So it is having a real terms impact. In terms of the challenges that orchestras are facing, the impact is largely financial and administrative. The good news is that orchestras are doing all they can to tour, to keep on the road, and they have done so ever since the early days of Brexit. But it is becoming financially unsustainable to continue to do that. The way that orchestras are managing that is by looking at fundraising where they can, or diverting their sources of income away from other types of activities. So, for example, community programs in the UK. So it is having an impact across the board. Touring isn't important just for touring's sake. It's important for UK orchestras in the terms of what it unlocks in terms of income and opportunity. UK orchestras who can tour can also build fundraising bases overseas. They can build international profile, which is absolutely essential to their national and international standing. And I will also mention that obviously there is a return for the UK. UK orchestras are world leading. We perform a very important soft power and international cultural diplomacy role for the UK. So it is important to maintain that and invest in that. Just a final point I'll make, which I echo what Naomi and Kate have said, but one thing I would just say to put this into context is that when it comes to orchestras, we come in different sizes and scale. Touring does not look the same for all UK orchestras, for those who do tour. And also that we're here discussing Brexit, but it cannot be looked at in isolation from other macroeconomic and geopolitical and inflationary factors which are impacting touring as well. Yes, there are Brexit-specific solutions, but it is generally much more difficult and expensive to tour. And for UK orchestras, Brexit challenges are just another in a long line of challenges on a sector that's already under very heavy financial pressure.
Thank you. Thank you, Cam.
Thanks, Chair.
Annalise.
Thank you, Chair. Before I ask my questions, I need to refer to my register of interest, and I'm a member of the Musicians' Union. I want to talk a bit about the mobility of people in the EU in terms of the tours. And Naomi, you were just talking about the 90 in 180-day rule, so I think I'll start there. And if you could just indulge me, because I've got a constituent who's been affected by this and actually lost a gig, a role that they've been in, a job that they've been in for 12 years with Anastasia. When this came in, they wrote an open letter and went quite public about it. Because of this rule, and like that was devastating for them on every level. And they pointed out as well that often European tours are in Britain as well. So he has not just lost jobs in Europe, but also in Britain as a musician who's a member of the band, and obviously that will go for crew as well. So I was just wondering if you could go into a little bit more about the 90 to 180-day rule and what that means for musicians and crew as well, and also what the difference is pre-Brexit, and what impact do you think that would have if the 90 and 180-day rule was sorted out? Like, would that fix quite a lot of the problems that we face? I don't know who wants to start. Naomi, I'm looking at you because you went into the last question, so...
Yeah, so I think there's a couple of problems. There's the 90 and the 180-day rule, which is to do with Schengen, but that it's not as sort of simple as that in a way. I mean, that's causing a lot of problems because musicians before Brexit could obviously just tour freely and go and pick up as many gigs as they wanted in Europe. So that's an issue, but also visa and work permit rules vary from territory to territory. So after Brexit, the industry spent a lot of time actually researching what the rules are in different territories, and even now we find musicians come up against kind of not having the right paperwork for a certain territory, and we think, well, we didn't know that was a requirement, and then you have to look into it, and then you find out maybe that actually it was just a mistake by a customs official. But it's very complex. It's not, it's if there was one kind of standard rule across all EU territories, that would resolve a lot of the problems in terms of admin. If we could get away from the 90 and 180-day rule, that would be fantastic, because we just want touring to be subject to as few restrictions as possible. But there's also issues like carnets, which are really costly. So some of that could actually be addressed by the UK government without necessarily needing to renegotiate with Europe. So it's complex, but I would say visa and work permits are definitely kind of at the top of the list of big problems.
Kate, have you had any direct experience of the 90 in 180 or crew members that you know, or musicians that?
Yeah, well, I think, crew obviously are working with multiple artists. So I'm promoting my album, but that my touring cycle is only so long and doesn't necessarily take up the whole year and isn't a full year's income for a crew member. So they might be working with other artists as well and going on multiple tours throughout the year. So then that can affect who I'm able to employ in terms of, are they actually able to do dates in Europe because of how many they've already done with other artists, not because they're not available. And I was going to add to what you were saying about the Robbie Williams tour, because it's not just difficult for the crew, that then is difficult for the entire show, because when you change out crew, it's like such a disruption to the tour, and people have to learn how the tour is working, and they might not be familiar with the equipment or how the band play or how the artist works or what's required on stage. So all of these delays can add stress and make people more tired, less sort of confident in their work. They're kind of overstretching themselves doing jobs that aren't necessarily theirs. I've had to have new crew members in before, and my guitarist is teaching them things that actually it's not really their job to do, and then all of the additional time can actually add up to more finance for me that might not have been budgeted in, because if you need extra days rehearsal to get crew used to working with the new band, if there are problems you have to work them out, that's costly, and rehearsal rooms have doubled in price. So I can actually, when I played Glastonbury, I did a rehearsal and I'd already spent my fee before I got to the site.
As a British artist and someone who has proudly, and thank you for your opening, it was absolutely brilliant and inspirational. You're proudly going out and promoting our culture. But if you were in a situation where you had a huge European tour that was looking to last 6 months, would you look to employ musicians and crew that had EU passports to get over this hurdle? What would you do? What predicament would you find yourself in?
Yeah, I really, I've played with my musicians for 12 years, and I think that is quite rare as a solo artist. You see it less and less now because people are, just saying it's just not affordable. There has been times where, I could have cut my band. I could just go with backing tracks, but I've really built something I believe in, and we put on a really amazing show. And I think, I looked at artists like Elton John, and when I have seen him live and the relationship he has with his musicians on stage is so amazing and beautiful. And I think that's what I believe in, is there's something really special about playing music with people for a long period of time. It's hard to go into with that sort of talking about magic and telepathy, but there's something that years and years of playing together and years of working together, as I'm sure you have your own experiences in a completely different way, just mean that you function really, really well. So I am always trying to put that first. That's a personal choice. I'm choosing not to sacrifice that integrity, but I do understand that I could profit more, maybe not go into debt sometimes. And I'm working on a record right now that's actually exploring my Irish heritage, and I'm trying to figure out what to do, because to really play the record I'd have to double the musicians that I have on stage. There's no way I can afford to do that. There's no way I can afford to play this record as it's meant to be played at the moment. I think it makes me think about, in comparison, merch companies, for example. It does the I might not necessarily be looking for band and crew in Europe. I know some artists would, and I think that that's okay, because it might be the only way to make it work. But for example, with merch, it's cheaper for me to get merchandise companies in Europe, because of I need merch to make the shows profitable. Sometimes the only profit you're making is from the merch. So being charged on that and being limited on how much merch you can bring in means it's taking business away from the UK, and artists are definitely going to be looking at like companies in Europe, because otherwise they're just not going to be able to make the tour happen. And I'm making financial sacrifice, but it would be cheaper for me to hire crew and band in Europe. If I didn't care about the relationships that I have and the shows that I've built, I would just let go of them and move my business to Europe to make it easier.
Yeah, thank you, Kate. And Naomi, you were talking about before about the problems experienced by EU visa rules. I wonder if you've already said quite a lot about it, but if you could just say a bit more about what that means practically.
Yeah, so the problem is there's no single source of information for explaining what visas and work permits you need for each territory. So the industry's tried to put that together ourselves. I mean, the UK government said it's not their role to kind of provide a source of information about different visa and work permit rules for different territories. So there's kind of navigating what you need for each territory, and then obviously there's the costs associated with if you have to pay for a visa or a work permit as well on top of that. So that's definitely been one of the major hurdles, I would say.
It sounds like it would be something that is particularly an issue for like the smaller and medium sized bands who don't have necessarily like infrastructure around them to sort all of that out for them, basically. And like we were talking about in the former panel about those stepping stones as well, and building your fan base, and
I think we've always said that kind of the really big artists and tours probably have teams that are, and they've kind of found ways to absorb costs, but it's difficult for them. But I think it is even more difficult at a grassroots level if you're a band trying to deal with it by yourself without any kind of support.
And Hanna, you were talking about how orchestras have got this on a bigger scale, so could you say a bit more about what steps they need to do to comply with EU visa requirements?
So the question is about mobility of people.
Yeah.
I will say for the record that actually for orchestras the issues are trucks and carnets. When it comes to the 90 and 180-day rule, visas and work permits, yes, that is an issue. It's an issue that we share across the sector. In the early days of Brexit, I had countless calls and emails from touring orchestras who were trying to navigate the 27 different visa systems across the EU member states, and also within member states. So you have countries like Germany, which will have different work permit arrangements depending on the region. So it's incredibly complex, and the onus was very much on the industry to figure it out, get our head around it, and produce reliable guidance for our touring orchestras, for our musicians. So that was a huge pressure. I would say that now, a few years on, we're kind of just getting on with it. That's not to say it's not something to be resolved, but as far as orchestras are concerned, that's something that's actually a bigger burden, I think, on individual musicians than orchestras themselves. So orchestras will be sorting out a huge amount of admin and paperwork around carnets and trucks, and then planning the tours and that sort of thing to make them as lean as possible. But the actual visas and work permits and whether someone's within their 90 and 180-day limit is actually something that musicians themselves and players themselves will be managing. I would say the impact is probably more on soloists or opera singers, which I think the earlier panel also talked about. Where orchestras can feel the impact on tour is that now that the UK is treated as a third country is when we're landing in European airports and we're stuck in endless queues now to get through passport control. And that can actually, even 1 hour's difference of a passport queue delay can make a huge impact on then rehearsal times and arriving in the venue and getting set up, and even musicians, the level of stress musicians might be feeling, and how tired they are after travel. Because of post-Brexit, touring schedules are much leaner and we have to be much more economical with that time. So there's a knock-on effect in different ways. In terms of actual cost, orchestras don't carry that cost ourselves.
Okay. Thank you.
Naomi, can I just take you back to what you said about there just being no one single source of information? So if that was to be provided, what would that look like? Who would do it? I mean, does the music industry not offer that kind of financial and practical and advisory support to artists and individuals who want to tour in the UK? To what extent should the government be offering that kind of information? What would that look like?
think initially we wanted the government to have a sort of hub of information where we could, and we also have been calling for an export office, so somewhere centralised. There's sort of export offices that have sprung up around the UK, but they play different roles. Some of them are more about funding showcases for artists rather than kind of doing the practical stuff. But yeah, the industry's tried to pull the information together, but there is a risk, obviously, that if we supply information to somebody and we get it wrong, that it's then going to have a massive impact on their touring. So it's a difficult thing to do. We're not experts on the visa regimes in every territory in Europe, but we've had to become experts in a way because Dave, my colleague behind me, his role has been very focused since Brexit on basically dealing with all the queries from musicians that we get. Yeah. We produced a flow chart so we could say to musicians, if you're touring, have you got this piece of paperwork? Have you got an instrument with protected species in it? So then you need this additional piece of paper, etc., etc. So we do provide a lot of guidance, but I think it would be helpful if there was sort of one hub or an export office where there were people who could pick up the phone and help.
And am I right in thinking that there are countries or territories who do have that sort of facility, like an export hub or an advisory office?
That's right. I think Canada and I think Australia have got quite, and as a result, their music industries have been boosted because they're doing a really good job of exporting talent and supporting talent to go out and tour.
I seem to recall that as well. Thank you very much. Cam, we've answered your question. Yeah. Oh, very good.
Can I add to that? Sorry.
Of course, yes.
Yeah, I was just going to add that I think the music industry has shown with its actions and refusal to act, they're not going to help. There's a lot that people have been asking the industry to do to help musicians, that the major companies benefiting the most from artists and profiting the most off of our work, they don't come to the table. So just to answer your question about will the industry help, the answer is, in my opinion, no. They haven't refused to help on many issues that we've already been asking them for help with.
They should, you think?
I think they should help in lots of ways, yeah. I think that Live Nation, Spotify and the major labels are responsible for a lot of the, if not all of the other problems that are going on in the industry. I think they've been very destructive to artists and artists' lives and the future of potential young new artists even being able to have the dream of having a career in the music industry. I think they will not do it voluntarily, but we're being asked to take all of the risk, and then they're sharing in majority of the profit in quite extreme ways, in ways I think are unethical. When I talk to people in other industries about how the music industry works, they're often quite shocked. I think we need to point the floodlights at these major companies that profit from us and refuse to help.
Okay, do you think that there's more the government could do to bring that to a head and bring about a different sort of set of solutions?
I do.
What would that look like?
I think, if we're talking specifically about Brexit, I think there's quite simple things that we've probably already even covered, with like merch costs and carnets and processing times. But in terms of the wider systemic problem, I would love to get back to you with like serious details of what I think could help, because I feel this is an entirely broken ecosystem. I don't know an artist that hasn't experienced sort of financial exploitation and unethical behaviour, and we don't have watchdogs, we don't have HR departments, we really don't have anyone. The people that are there to help us are usually the ones who are hurting us, to be honest. And I haven't seen anything like, apart from external bodies like the Music Venue Trust and the FAC, people actually trying to make a difference. None of it's coming from the major companies that are making all of the money.
Thank you, that's really helpful. I'm going to move to Jeff. Please.
Yeah, I've got some questions I want to move on to, but just before we do, on that's really interesting. And you mentioned Live Nation and Spotify, which are very different parts of the industry, I suppose. Yeah. So who could coordinate that? Could you get the three big record companies to try and pull everybody together to give advice and support to artists?
Like I said, I don't think it would have to be forced. Yeah. Because they don't do that, and I don't know why they don't do that. Because why aren't they helping artists earn money and have careers and tour? Why do artists eat all of the risk? But I would love to see them become responsible and actually create an environment for artists to flourish, create opportunity, nurturing the industry, not destroying it. Could there be specific grants that they're actually contributing to? I think they should be forced to share a split of their profits with grassroots venues of independent artists, or even just paying people fairly to begin with, And they are really separate companies, and they do really separate things, but they're very much linked. They're very much linked, all of them.
Yeah.
Do you mind if I just briefly comment on that, just to say that I think that record labels used to provide more in terms of tour support for artists, which is like really invaluable investment. It used to be the case that you go on tour to promote the recording because the recording would make money. Now artists aren't making money from their recorded music, and so live music has to play a bigger part in kind of sustaining their careers. So with the cost of touring, it's becoming more difficult to do that. So it is getting harder and harder for artists to make a living.
Okay. I was actually going to ask about the dreaded carnets, was my topic. So we're just trying to maybe start with you, Hanna, because you talked about how this is maybe the biggest problem for orchestras. So carnets and cites, we're just trying to get a picture of how the problems with them affect tour budgets and scheduling. So how does it work for a big orchestra?
So obviously pre-Brexit, the carnets, which are essentially like passports for instruments, were not needed. Now that we're treated as a third country, we obviously have to have these. And this is something that orchestras are having to employ extra administrative staff to process in the preparation and planning for a tour. So carnets can cost up to £10,000 additional cost per tour. And the processing of that admin now has been compared to the preparation for a tour to Asia or to the US, to what is, as I said, to our closest market, our next door neighbors, so it shouldn't have to carry that kind of burden. So we are seeing really significant costs, and to put that into some context, the extra costs that we're seeing to a tour, as I say, tours can really vary in shape and size, but the figures that we've had from a range of our member orchestras are showing additional costs of around £5,000 to £25,000 per tour of a range of these different elements, whether it's carnets or other elements. Cabotage adds on a whole separate part, which I'm very keen to talk about at some point.
Get onto that in a minute.
We'll circle back. But in terms of the carnets, that is, we are feeling a real terms impact.
Okay, and in terms of the scheduling, I think some of the big orchestras have their own big trucks that they take their musicians' equipment out in. So how does that work? Is there like an inspection process that takes a long time that you have to build into the schedule? How does it work?
Inspection process, you mean in terms of the truck itself that we're using? Well, so yes, many orchestras will have specialized trucks operated on what's called own account under the cabotage rules, under the TCA. These trucks are often taxpayer funded, they're publicly subsidized. They are specially built to be able to transport high value instruments, so instruments that can be of value between £4 to £10 million. They'll include temperature controls, humidity controls, special brackets, cushioning, and they'll often be driven by stage managers who are also specialists in knowing how to handle these very expensive, very delicate instruments and how to set them up on stage. So it's not just about the truck, but these trucks, because of the cabotage rules, because they're UK registered, are sitting in the UK and they're not being used. Instead, orchestras are having to hire EU hauliers with EU plates, and that does add a significant cost that can add up to £16,000 a day on tour. And what would make up those costs are when orchestras are waiting for trucks because they're not using their own and they're now subject to different checks and stops. They're having to factor in costs for musicians and players who are having to have extra nights on tour or waiting time or whatever it may be. It all adds up. So it's not just the cost of the truck or just the issue of the truck, it's the knock-on effect that has. This obviously also has, it's not economical. It doesn't make sense in terms of the investment that's made, and also it has an environmental impact. In terms of the planning for a tour, now orchestras will be operating much leaner budgets, so they'll be using just one truck instead of two. That will affect the routing. a challenge that we found in the early days of Brexit, and this was a real concern across the industry, not just orchestras, but the rock and pop world as well, with whom we collaborate really closely, found that there was actually a concern about the actual availability of these specialised trucks in Europe, because the UK actually has a much a richer supply of these specialists. So the impacts of this go quite wide.
Okay, thanks. And Kate, Naomi, I think you both mentioned the issue of border checks and delays. Maybe if you could just give us a bit of an indication of how big a problem that is.
I guess I can speak to, like if you're held up, first of all, it would be really hard to build in an extra day for additional travel on top, to put 2 travel days into a tour. If you don't need it, would add thousands, because I would be paying, if there's 10 members of crew, everybody's wages for the day, plus an additional the driver cost and the bus rental, and then or if you're in a van, hotel costs, and all of the costs for these things have actually really gone up as well. And then if you're in a van, or you might be asked to, everybody has to get up at 4 a.m. and get out of the vehicle, and things have to be searched, and then that can affect people's well-being, ability to do their job, and just sort of it does cause quite a bit of disruption. And again, like worst case scenario, you're held up so much that you miss the show. I've seen that happen to bands before.
How often does that happen, those sorts of delays and issues caused by them?
We've had a lot of examples of that. So just a couple of case studies. Just one of our members just recently contacted us to say that he was taking some merchandise with him on tour. He had the EORI number that I mentioned earlier. He'd done an online customs declaration. That was what we thought you needed to do. But he was stopped and held for 2 hours in customs, and he was fined €600, which, because apparently he didn't have a piece of paperwork that was required specifically for France. But we looked into it afterwards, and I think it was an error, so we're going to try and pursue to get the money back for him. But obviously it was distressing. It delayed him getting to the venue and actually being able to perform, not to mention having to suddenly stump up €600. We had another member who was travelling who was asked for proof of ownership of their instrument, kind of proof of purchase, which they didn't have with them. Again, you shouldn't need to have that. So the problem is that customs officials sometimes, it's one thing thinking that you understand what the rules are, but it's another thing on the ground if a customs official wants to ask a difficult question and you don't have a piece of paperwork because you didn't think that you needed it.
Right, thank you. And merchandise, Kate, you mentioned, I think you said you'd now source merchandise in Europe for your tours, is that right? And is that something that a lot of musicians are doing? I suppose, again, we would just want to get an indication of the problems that the merch rules cause.
So if you're bringing in your own merch from the UK, there's a limit on how much you can bring in, which merch, as I said, can literally make or break a tour. It can stop it going into the red. It could actually enable you to profit. It's obviously something you can't quantify completely or know exactly how much merch you're going to sell, but you can have an idea, especially if you've done a lot of touring. And the limitations on how much you can bring in from the UK mean that you're taking another financial risk. And so if you maybe can find a company in Europe that doesn't, that isn't a UK company, because then you're not limited and you can get it delivered, that will mean that you can go on the tour or not.
Okay. And some artists, presumably, that plays into the idea that some artists are now just not touring the EU because of those sorts of problems, I've heard
people just say, what's the point, because it's just too... It's like, it is supposed to be our job. We love it and it's passionate and it's really fun and whatever, but it's also work and it is our job and we are supposed to earn from it. Somewhere.
Naomi, you said earlier, I think, the issue of carnets could be resolved by the government without a whole new negotiation. So why haven't we done that? Why aren't we doing that?
So I've got a great list of things that we could do unilaterally, because I think there's 2 elements to this. There's sort of, we actually have had a lot of engagement with the government about this issue, and we're having really regular meetings with DCMS officials about it, and we have met with Minister Nick Thomas-Symonds to talk about it. So we know that there's a sort of will on both sides to try and resolve the issues, but I think that it's a negotiation. There's probably going to have to be a package that's of mutual benefit. But we could potentially make some improvements ourselves. For example, Carnet costs are obviously a big challenge, but the UK government could speak to the London Chamber of Commerce and try and negotiate the Carnet fees down. Because I think that, there's an element of this is something we didn't have to do before, and it is actually very expensive, so it's a money-making exercise to a certain extent. So that's something we could tackle. We could also look at making St Pancras a port for CITES, because if you're carrying an instrument that has an endangered species like ivory in it, you have to go to a CITES port and you have to have your musical instrument certificate stamped. But if we could make St Pancras a port, or I understand one of the problems with St Pancras is that it doesn't have enough storage space. So another option would be to look at Ashford in Kent, for example. Mm-hmm. So it's just kind of exploring what potential options there might be to make things easier without necessarily having to renegotiate. Mm-hmm. Another thing is rejoining the Pan-European Mediterranean Convention, which is to do with the rules of origin. So I mentioned before, if a T-shirt's manufactured in the EU, it's easier to move it around without the admin burden in the EU, so it simplifies trade. So that's potentially a group that we could join, and then that would actually make things easier. So we can send a detailed briefing on this. One other problem is the A1 forms, that there's a huge backlog with HMRC, and just putting more resource into getting those processed quickly would make a huge difference to our members.
Right. I'll just one second, Hannah. Are you confident the government are engaging properly on this and trying to make these changes that you're proposing?
I do believe the will's there, and we're doing a lot of work at the moment on cultural exchange, where we're working with organisations in the UK representing different art forms and organisations in Europe as well. I think that there was a common understanding reached which talked about trying to resolve some of these problems, but we've had no concrete changes yet, so that's what we're looking for. But they are engaging with us. I think that there was, in the negotiations, there's sort of a view that this is a one-sided problem because it affects us more than it affects EU territories. However, we talked to the independent festival sector and they said they are booking fewer EU artists. So we have got evidence that it's not just a one-sided problem. And obviously we want to facilitate the cultural exchange, which should be a benefit to both sides.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Thank you. I wanted to mention, I'm really pleased Naomi name-checked so many of those issues which we agree need to be resolved and can be resolved in the UK. They are not dependent on EU TCA renegotiation, whether that's processing A1s, whether that's looking at carnets. An orchestra-specific issue which could be addressed unilaterally by the UK is looking at the reversal of the policy change that happened to orchestra tax relief, whereby now orchestras can no longer claim for a number of their EU touring costs. And that is having an impact of up to £400,000 for some UK orchestras. So it's a really significant. The money that's made from touring is directly reinvested back in the UK and supports UK activity. So it's really critical that orchestras are able to access as much of that support as possible. Another issue we haven't mentioned that I do want to mention is that of withholding tax. I think the earlier panel may have touched on it. But this is having a cash flow impact on orchestras, and this is something that could be looked at bilaterally with EU member states, so again, isn't necessarily reliant on EU renegotiation. And this is having an impact of up to £250,000 for one of our member orchestras, which is money they've been waiting for 2 years from a particular tour. So there are things that could be looked at. In terms of, because we're running out of time and as we're on solutions, I do just want to emphasize that resolving the cabotage issue for orchestras would be transformative, even if it's looking at a temporary solution and not a permanent one in the lead up to the 2026 TCA review or the next UK-EU summit.
I was just going to come on to cabotage, actually. So okay. I don't know if there's anything more you want to say about the problems it causes. You've already touched on that, but you talked about temporary solutions. Are there kind of workarounds that can be in place to make that happen?
The workarounds are already in place using EU hauliers, and that's incredibly expensive and that's not sustainable, and it doesn't make sense in terms of UK orchestras own their own trucks, which are perfectly... there are already precedents in international trade sort of legal frameworks and within the EU that already exempt own account and cabotage transport, by cultural organisations that exempt them from those limitations that we now face. And it's unclear why that wasn't actually included within the TCA. The common thinking is that it was just an oversight. So there's no reason actually for it to be this way. But we appreciate that, it's difficult. What we are told, the feedback we're given by officials is that it's about making the case about the mutual benefit to the EU. So I do think that that's where we could use support in terms of making that case in terms of the data about how this is mutually beneficial. But this is why we do collaborate very closely across the music sector and the wider creative industries in forming the Cultural Exchange Coalition and looking to encourage EU voices to the table to help recognise those benefits, because ultimately cabotage will have to be looked at in that context.
Okay. Naomi, you presumably there are European equivalents of the Musicians' Union that you deal with, and can you get them to come to the table and talk about the mutual benefits of sorting this problem out?
Yeah, we have been engaging with them, and we are, part of the intention of this group that's just been set up, the Cultural Exchange Coalition, is to try and work with people on both sides, if you like, to try and illustrate that there are problems and that there's very much a will to try and address this and find solutions.
Okay. How much cost does it add on to a tour? These, I suppose it's separate, it'll be different for an orchestra and for a band, but at what point does it become unviable just because of cabotage?
Well, so I mentioned the cost of £16,000 per day. That obviously is not sustainable. A EU haulier can cost around £30,000 per tour, and a tour would normally, pre-Brexit, make a surplus of around up to £100,000. So obviously these are figures that eat into that surplus quite significantly. I did mention UK orchestras are on the road. We're making sure that we're staying on the road because it is so important to us financially and artistically and in terms of our international profile. So we have to continue to make it happen. So I suppose I can't give you a figure as to, well, where's the cliff edge? At what point do we stop touring? Because that's obviously not where we want to get to. At the moment, we're using all of our possible resources to make that happen, and we're absorbing those costs where we can. But as I say, an example of how that's working is by diverting investment from other activities that might be taking place in the UK, for example. The point to make is that costs are rising, whether that's Brexit related or COVID impact, which continues, or other macroeconomic issues, and geopolitical factors. But promoters' fees are not rising. So ultimately, these are all costs that are being absorbed by the orchestras. And it's particularly challenging for those touring orchestras who also don't receive any public subsidy. So it's challenging.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Jeff. Naomi, you said that the carnets are paid to the London Chamber of Commerce.
Yeah,
that's so odd, isn't it? Why? And why do they charge so much?
There's a couple of different carnet providers. So we early on negotiated a small discount for our members to get a discount on carnets. But basically, you have to pay a security deposit, which is, as I said earlier, I think 30 to 40% of the value of your instruments and equipment. And there's a cost to get the carnet itself. And also they're introducing digital carnets, which sounds positive, but I understand that with a digital carnet, if you break a piece of equipment on tour and you have to replace it, you have to apply for the carnet again from scratch and pay again. So it's a massive burden, and I believe that the providers could potentially bring the cost down.
And have those conversations taken place? Do you know?
Well, not between anyone from the government and the providers, I don't think. I mean, we've had multiple meetings with the providers.
Who are the insurance companies?
So there's London Chamber of Commerce, and there's a carnet provider. Dave will know, but I can give you the details.
It's a Boomerang, but there are
Boomerang.
various chambers of commerce across the UK.
Yeah.
Interesting. Okay, thank you very much. We need to follow that up. Who's next? Rupa.
Thanks, and thank you, the three of you. I've got foundations in my head on earworm now the whole day, but it's a good earworm to have, so thanks. I've got two constituents who email me a lot of this from both of your sectors. Tasmin Little, who's a classical musician, and also, what's his name, James McVeigh from the Vants. And I remember in COVID, we had a sort of Zoom and everyone was saying all these doom and gloom things were going to happen post-Brexit. I mean, COVID was a big blow as it was. And it sounds like from what you're saying, this nightmarish bureaucratic landscape, that it's all come to pass. So I wanted to ask really about collaboration. So Tasmin Little, her email to me says, musicians need to be able to travel last minute for cancellations without worrying about carnets and visas. And we need to make it easier for international musicians to come here too. So I'm of an age where I remember things like Blur and Françoise Hardy doing a duet, and I think St Etienne and Etienne Daho. Kate and Naomi, well, in fact, all three of you, are you finding that these, Naomi, you mentioned cultural exchange, that these sort of cross-country collaborations are dying because of all this?
I would say they're very possible if you're on a major label, and outside of that, if you're an independent artist, a lot more difficult.
So with all these things, it's the little guys who'll be hit hardest, who are being hit. Yeah.
Who could be potentially the future big guys.
Yeah, that's true. You're choking off that talent stream that they would have grown.
I mean, so part of our work with the Cultural Exchange Coalition is to try and highlight some of the examples of brilliant projects that are happening sort of in spite of all the problems. So if you look at the proms, for example, lots of artists, orchestras, soloists, conductors come over for the proms. It could be a lot easier if we were still part of the EU, so it has got a bit harder. But that's quite a major operation, the proms. So cultural exchanges happens on a kind of major scale like that between organisations, but it's the really small scale stuff, like I mentioned earlier, a freelance orchestral musician being able to go and play with an orchestra in Europe and getting that experience, sitting next to somebody different, learning in that environment. Playing for a different conductor, you know, all of that helps to build careers, especially if you're kind of emerging talent. So it's that kind of thing that I think we're really missing out on.
I would say from orchestra's perspective, actually, I wouldn't say cultural partnerships are dropping off. I think that there is a huge demand for UK orchestras and collaborations in Europe because we are world-leading. We're seen as innovative not only in terms of what we present artistically, but also as we operate as organizations in terms of our policies around developing talent or community engagement or education or in the environment. UK orchestras actually are leading the way on a lot of those areas, and so European partners want to work with us as a result. What is dropping off and what is much more difficult is the sort of shorter-term opportunities, although tours obviously are planned in the long term, so we don't operate like gigging musicians. We won't just jump in a truck and head over to France, but we will, pre-Brexit, we would have completed much shorter tours, for example, of just 2 or 3 dates or 2 or 3 venues and coming back to the UK. Now we're having to pack in many more dates for a longer tour, which puts on a lot of pressure across the board, be on the orchestra and on players and on crew. So that's what we've seen drop off, not necessarily the demand and the appetite or the actual appetite for the cultural exchange.
I would add to that it probably also really impacts support slots. So artists that get offered a support tour or being able to bring someone on the road because you're not the headlining act, you're not paid anywhere near as much, but it can be a great opportunity to tap into somebody else's audience, but just probably impossible to do. I would imagine going to Europe from the UK on a support slot, because I just don't know how much money you need to make that work. I've had people, I've offered support slots to people where we've had them travel with us, and that's how it can be possible, but then they're just kind of doing it completely on their own, and it would be impossible otherwise for them to do it, you know.
The support act would be from the EU rather than getting someone, because there are lots of examples of when people were coming for the support and they, by the end of the tour, became bigger than the main act.
Yeah,
like
I think that
Pixies and people like that,
yeah,
historically.
Like bands being able to go on the road together like that has definitely impacted, because for the support act, I just don't know how it would be possible to eat and pay for somewhere to sleep and, you know, do what you need to do to make the show happen.
And I was just reminded of the example of Trigger Cut. It was a German punk band. It was all over the news a couple of years ago that they were stopped at the border and sent packing, although they'd sold out a tour, because they didn't realise a bit of paper that every venue had to send. Is that kind of thing lessening now there's more awareness of this nightmarish jungle of paperwork, or is that still happening?
I I think the reason that it's seen as a one-sided issue is because if you're coming from the EU, you're obviously just dealing with one set of rules. So I think the paid permitted engagement route for gigs is quite simple, but they probably had to get some evidence of the engagement basically from each venue, which obviously our members would have to do as well if they're applying for visas in different territories. So I think that the problem is there's probably still a lack of awareness amongst grassroots musicians about exactly what they need in some circumstances.
And this idea of sort of it being a one-sided issue when it's actually mutually annoying for everyone, what are the incentives for EU member states to get behind an EU-UK agreement for touring artists? I mean, we're always told they want to punish us. Is that true?
That's not the impression we've got. We've actually went to meet a joint parliamentary group of MEPs and MPs where the issue was well understood. They were really receptive to talking to us, and they were very kind of keen to see the issues addressed. So I think that, as I said before, it's part of a negotiation, so I think it is going to have to be part of a package, so that presumably there's going to have to be something that is in it for the EU side as well. But I think cultural exchange has value to both sides. I mean, if you think about all the impacts of kind of taking a band on tour, and you've got, as Kate said, artists are massive employers of crew and musicians, going to places to tour, reaching an audience there, but also paying for hotel accommodation, buying food, all of the surrounding businesses benefit from that. You know, restaurants close to the venue will benefit from that. Potentially you've got UK audience members travelling to watch the gig, and they're going to be tourists. So I think that just making it work for both sides is mutually beneficial, and that's an argument we're really keen to get across.
Is it true the majority of trucking companies that service these are British? I've heard that somewhere.
Definitely the UK trucking companies are specialist, and there is more of these specialist trucks here than there are in Europe. Some have registered themselves, and they're operating both in the EU and the UK. That's not something that UK orchestras can take advantage of. That has been a workaround that's been found by the road haulage industry, but largely, where orchestras are concerned, we need to be able to use our own trucks.
And then just so sort of when the Beatles played Hamburg, that was pre-EU, was it? That was before
61.
Yeah. I mean, because some of the most vehement people, like Roger Daltrey, they're the biggest Brexiteers, and they're saying it's fine. It was fine before, but that's a totally different legislative landscape, right?
I don't think most musicians, let's say, definitely this is a big issue for them, and they don't, even kind of Elton John's spoken out about this, so even though his tour can probably manage the additional costs and admin, I think it's still just seen as a massive retrograde step for the industry, really, that we're in a situation where, you know, I said carnets used to be the stuff of kind of legend, but now they're back and we're having to deal with them, we're having to pay for them again, so yeah.
Just also, I think you did answer it, Naomi, to Jeff, but Hanna, how proactively are the music sector organisations like yourselves petitioning our government and also the EU governments?
Very.
Right. Okay.
Very, and since before Brexit, after the referendum, the creative industries as a whole, I think the music industry in particular, has been incredibly active and engaged. And what's been working is that we work very closely together. So it's not, we're coming together by art form, by music genre. The Cultural Exchange Coalition isn't just a music industry initiative. It does represent dancers, theatre, visual arts. So it is a cross-creative industries initiative. And I would say we're very practical. We're proposing a lot of solutions. I have colleagues in the sector who have employed barristers to propose visa waiver solutions to the government. So I feel we're doing all we humanly possibly can already on very under a lot of pressure in a sector that's already under a lot of pressure in terms of our resources that we have available to pour into this. But we're absolutely committed to working together with the UK government and with the EU and member state policymakers to find solutions to this. And I will say, it does bear recognition that we obviously are apolitical, but since we've seen a change in government, we have seen a change in engagement on this with the sector. So I think it is worth recognising that the arts ministers have been more personally engaged with this, that officials are working really hard with us on this. I still think that there's a clear disconnect, though, in terms of what's happening between the government's commitment to resolving this, which has been communicated in its manifesto or in the creative industries sector plan or at the last UK-EU summit. There's a clear statement of commitment, but then what's happening across government departments, and this was touched on in the earlier panel, there is a disconnect. So on the one hand, we're trying to resolve touring barriers, but on the other, we're for example, looking at consultations where new fees might be applied to musical instrument certificates, or where A1 forms are not being properly processed, or there are changes to cultural tax reliefs which make it more expensive for us to tour. There are things that probably need to better connect in terms of the commitment and what's actually happening in reality.
I'd like to add, just from the artist's perspective, we are completely desperate at this point. I think that I can speak for most artists that they feel similarly, that there is a broken core of the music industry. So anything that can be done that makes it easier and more financially viable helps. So, improving processing times on A1 forms, like reducing carnet costs, being able to relax the rules or increase limits regarding movement of merchandise. These are all really, really helpful things, because everything, we need all the help that we can get in a basically unregulated industry that is, in my opinion, exploitative. I think that music is work. I think we need to really start to see it as work. Why don't we have a Fair Wages Act? Why aren't we auditing and investigating these companies that practice things, I think, that are unethical in comparison to other industry standards? We're desperate as artists for any help that the government is willing to give us would be great.
Someone's taking heed, because we are doing a reset.
The government needs to put its money where its mouth is. Excellent. Let's have Vicky.
Right, so I think I've got this final bit, which is actually the solutions focus. Now, I know you've already touched on a lot of different solutions at different times, so don't feel the need to have to repeat any of that. But one question that I need to shoehorn in that does needs to have a solutions focus with it is when you were talking about the issue of class, and that actually this does have a big impact in terms of working class people coming through. And when I asked a similar question to the previous panel in terms of the reduction of working class people working in the creative industries, and whether or not the impact of Brexit touring, etc., had an impact on reduction in terms of working class numbers, they said not really. But I think you were saying something else, Kate, and it'd be interesting to hear from everybody in terms of this. And what can we do, so there's my solution bit, to get more working class people able to be in the industry as well?
Okay. I think, the problems domestically are impacting the problems in the rest of the world. So I hope I've expressed how these are really interconnected and how they have a knock-on effect on each other. So as I was saying, someone from a working class background with no disposable income who couldn't support themselves financially to make a show in London happen, let alone a tour domestically, let alone shows in Europe, because they might not have 600 quid, they might not have the cost, money saved to be able to pay for a carnet. I think that working class people, no disposable income, no support financially from a major, from an OnlyFans, from whatever it is, are not going to be able to play shows in Europe. They're not going to be able to play shows here necessarily. I hope that answers the question, the first part of the question. And then what are we going to do to make... I don't know, why you would want to have a career in the music industry, apart from that you love music, and I think it's the best job in the world and I love what I do, but it's impossible. I don't know how Kate Nash now would start a career when I worked in Nando's and my mum was a nurse and I have no connections and no sort of disposable financial support from parents. I really don't know how I would be able to do it. I don't think that I would have been able to have the career that I have if I was starting now. And I think that anything, like I said, that we could do to make getting to Europe easier would be great. But we also need to look at domestically. And these companies, like I keep banging on about, but that are making millions out of artists and making it impossible for them to have future careers. And like, it's going to happen that these artists aren't going to exist. I don't know what Glastonbury will look like in 20 years if we carry on like this. Don't know it's going to be that interesting. Maybe there'll be more interesting worldwide acts and European acts, but I don't know what will happen to UK culture if we close the doors on making it accessible. It's so wrong. Like, I feel really emotional about it because I think it is so wrong. It's such a letdown. And they're exploiting people off of the work that they're doing, musicians, artists, and never getting involved in the conversation, never caring, never being willing to move at all on anything, not even being transparent about the deals that they've made, the majors and the streamers, pointing the finger at each other all the time, blaming. They're both responsible. They are both massively responsible, and so are Live Nation. They're making enough money to be able to financially contribute, and I think that they should be forced to financially contribute. I don't actually want them running it because I don't trust them, but I think that they should financially contribute to making an environment that, working class kids could go, oh, I can see a future here, because I tell you, they cannot see a future right now. It's just not possible. That's why I'm saying we're desperate, because I've seen those doors, like, closing. Sorry for the desperation, I just genuinely feel it.
It's really good. So you're kind of saying, like, years ago this wasn't the case, but now things have just got so much worse.
I hate that when I'm asked in interviews, what's your advice to young people? I'm like, it's way worse now. Why is it worse now? It should be better. There's actually there could be so many opportunities. I mean, it really should be better. I shouldn't be feeling this, because I think that, like, if things were different, it would be amazing right now to be a young up-and-coming artist with how much could potentially be at your fingertips, and, like, the exposure, the connection with fans, the way that you're able to build things. It could be so much better. It's not that, like, oh, it's over and, boo-hoo, like, there's nothing we can do. No, there are things that we can do. And people need to start taking responsibility. The people profiting need to start taking responsibility. And the government, anything that you guys can do to make it easier financially across the, Europe and domestically would help. But it's not a simple solution. And it's a massive letdown to the entire country. And I do, we hold ourselves as this barometer of cool and culture. It's going to be gone. It's going to go away if we don't do something.
So kind of just wider on that, are there any other bits in terms of solutions that people want to kind of feed in to make sure that we're not missing anything, because the expertise that you have had and the passion is really powerful?
Sorry if I don't know.
No, go ahead.
I was just going to talk about, I think the Select Committee did a great study into music streaming and made great recommendations. So it would be lovely to follow up on that another time, because I could talk about that in a lot of detail, and I'd love to. But on just a couple of solutions potentially for the EU touring issue, a visa waiver agreement. We think there's a document that's come out of the EU Commission in the last week saying that they're actually considering this and looking at how they could make touring easier. So that's a fantastic development, and we hope that they'll pursue that with a bit of additional pressure perhaps from the UK. Also a touring visa that could be applied for, possibly paid for, but hopefully a very reasonable fee, could be evidenced by a contract if you are attached to a specific tour. So if you're playing with Kate on a tour, you could evidence that you're contracted by Kate for a certain period of time, and then they could hopefully get past the 90-day limit because you're attached to a particular tour and it can be evidenced. That would be fantastic, because that would open up a lot more opportunities and resolve the issue of crew having to come back after 90 days.
I think most of the solutions have been mentioned, so I won't take up time mentioning it, but I have to emphasize again, resolving cabotage would be absolutely transformative for UK orchestras and reducing the cost and administrative burden that we're carrying with that. You also asked a question about the access and how we build that, and I suppose I would make the point that this is bigger than just touring, that actually looking at how we're investing in the performing arts and in UK culture is all part of that picture. How are we investing in music education? How are we investing in the regional infrastructure for touring organisations and for venues and orchestras across the country? So I think that what I would encourage is to look at this in a big picture way, and actually the knock-on effects this is all having across the cultural industry and the creative industries. And I mentioned before, there is a return on investment in this. We're part of the creative industries. That's identified as one of the government's 8 growth sectors. Music and the performing arts, I think, is identified as a frontier sector with exceptional growth potential. So the case has been made. I think it's just about addressing those policy areas that can help support performing arts organizations in the music industry in the range of activities that we're involved in, including touring.
Thank you, Vicky. So, Hanna, we heard yesterday that the UK ministers met with the EU Trade Commissioner to discuss the UK-EU reset, as they're calling it. So this makes this session rather timely. We have a tendency of having a bit of a mystic Meg moment in these moments. I'm wondering whether you think improving cultural exchange is high enough on the government's agenda when they have these kind of talks.
It's hard to say. I think that clearly the fact that a commitment to improving touring arrangements at the last UK-EU summit in London, the fact that there was a commitment made as part of those talks, that's very welcome and that's really encouraging. I think that clearly there is a government commitment. I do think that what would be helpful to understand is where is the blockage? Why aren't we making more progress? Because we've been making the same arguments for the last, I don't know how many years, for the last 6 years. And yet we're still talking about the same challenges that we were during the referendum. So I think it's about finding the solution to that. What is the blockage? Because despite all of our engagement with government and very candid conversations we have with officials and with ministers, that's still not very clear to me. So I think the commitment is there, but clearly there's something that we're unable to overcome.
Thank you. And Naomi, I mean, if there fails to be an agreement between the UK and the EU, is there anything that the UK could be doing, UK government could be doing kind of unilaterally to make this situation better?
Definitely. I mean, obviously, the impression we got from the European side is that they don't want to reopen the TCA because they still see it as being a relatively new trade agreement. However, there's definitely an opportunity for a kind of side agreement around some of the issues that are kind of created by us being outside the EU. But I think some of the issues around A1 forms that we've mentioned around just HMRC having more resources to actually, and prioritising them, making sure that we get down the processing times, making sure that we don't introduce fees for musical instrument certificates, which would be creating a new barrier rather than removing barriers. Also, trying to get the carnet fees down, and again looking at the CITES port, whether we could have St Pancras or Ashford as a designated port, which would make it much easier for our members.
Okay, that's brilliant.
And can I add to that list, I'm sorry, also looking at how cultural tax reliefs can incentivise international touring?
Yeah, so your orchestra tax relief,
yes.
that I've made a note of that one. Great, thank you so much. Thank you to all of you for your time today, and particularly for your engagement and the passion with which you present it. If you've got one final message for us to pass on to the government on your behalf, what would it be, Hanna?
Oh my gosh. One final message. I would say that this is a problem that's worth solving. There's a return on this investment and there are practical solutions.
Naomi?
Music industry is actually bigger than the fishing industry in terms of kind of economic value to the UK, and you wouldn't know that when you hear about what the content of the negotiations has been. So I just think this issue, it's a manifesto commitment. It has to be prioritised in the negotiations. We've talked about youth mobility. We know the EU wanted that, for example. We've got to make sure when we're agreeing things with the EU that we make sure that we get this issue resolved as part of the package.
Okay.
Yeah, I think just to kind of agree with you guys, it's take seriously the people that are making all the money for, you know, that's the artists and the musicians. We don't earn all the money, but we make it possible for people to earn that money. And if we can profit from our work, we can actually contribute more and the ecosystem could flourish.
Thank you all for your time today. Great to see you.
Thank you.
Thank you all.